The Russian public is panicking as rumors spread that the Kremlin might freeze Russians' bank accounts. Just why might they feel they need to take this extreme step? And what are they doing to try to reassure the Russian public so that they continue to support the Russian war machine? Plus, is the Australian government saying all options are on the table in response to the alleged killing of an Australian volunteer? And of course, we're going to talk about the rumor that Ukrainian troops are being transferred from the Air Force into the infantry. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is, I think, the top story here is that Russians are increasingly nervous about rumors that the central bank is going to freeze deposits, right? Now, this is something that is part of a Russian fight against inflation that has been spiraling out of control in the country. Officially, they say it's only 9%. But if you look at the price of groceries and other goods, which we did here on this channel, actually. We looked back at Russian grocery store tour videos and we tried to compare different like items in major urban areas. And we've calculated the actual inflation rate probably closer to about 25%, which tracks that the central bank interest rates are currently at 21%. Now, this is the desired effect, but most analysts actually thought that the central bank was going to hike rates even higher. And what's bizarre is that it actually hasn't, right? Because remember, when these interest rates are really high, the Russian government has to ultimately pay those interest rates. And so while on one hand, it can temporarily slow the economy, it's only a temporary measure, right? All of this sort of interest rate gaming is not going to necessarily shift or grow the economy. You can't grow an economy by messing with the dials of these kind of interest rates. But for Putin, he appeared to directly intervene in the central bank policy making in order to keep this interest rate where it is. What has that meant? Well, what that's meant is that for the Russian ruble, it's continued to fall. It's now been consistently below 100 rubles per dollar, which is the lowest we've seen the ruble essentially this century. Now, that means, though, that Telegram rumors have begun to spread that citizens' bank deposits might be frozen. And the Russian central government actually addressed these, saying that the idea is, quote, absurd and unthinkable. They said, quote, in addition to the fact that a bank deposit freeze, is a gross violation of the right of citizens and companies to manage their assets, such a step will undermine the foundations of the banking system and the financial stability of the country. Now, obviously, when interest rates are that high, there is actually a flood of bank deposits, right? And recently, rumors emerged that retail deposits could be frozen. Now, why might they actually want to do this, despite the Russian central bank denials? Well, the answer is that, first off, the central bank, if they were to implement this policy, they would not want to give people a heads up, right? Why? Because what they're trying to do is prevent capital flight. What is capital flight? Well, capital flight in economics is when assets or money rapidly flow out of a country due to an event of economic consequence or a political event like regime change or globalization. Now, these events can be things like increases in taxes, but also countries defaulting on its debt, or just a currency crisis. And this is something that is really common. In fact, you saw it in European countries in some cases during the debt crisis, where individuals would wake up. Classic example would be somewhere like Greece, right? A lot of very wealthy people in Greece and even middle-class Greeks during the debt crisis in the early 2010s woke up and they said, damn, I don't trust the stability of our banking system. I don't trust our country's ability to manage this economy. And so they said, I'm going to sell my assets here in Greece and I'm going to move that money, I'm going to move that wealth into a more stable form abroad. And so one example would be, they might put it as a deposit in Swiss bank accounts. They might have taken it and purchased American companies, right? American stocks or equities. All of these things are crucially important for these individuals to say, hey, listen, I don't trust that having my wealth denominated in this currency is such a good idea. But if you are a country, particularly a country with its own currency, like Russia is, the risk of capital flight is tremendous. Because you notice in the story, what's the first thing these people did when they pulled their money out of the bank? In the case of Russia, this is what the Kremlin fears would happen. Inflation rate is extremely high, meaning that every month a ruble is worth less and less and less money. And the average Russian looks and says, listen, I need to just own something that is denominated in a currency other than rubles. I don't want to own ruble-denominated assets. So they pull out the rubles, then they go to some kind of bank or currency exchanger, and they sell their rubles to buy whatever currency they want to purchase their assets in abroad. So again, a good example would be simply euros. They say, listen, I just want to hold euros. I want them in a European bank. And so they go and they sell their rubles and they buy euros. Well, what happens when you want to sell, when everyone tries to sell their rubles at once? The value of the ruble gets pushed even further down. And this is how you can get hyperinflation. When no one wants to hold your currency because they think it's inflating too quickly, then what you end up with is a situation where everyone tries to sell that currency, thereby making it inflate even faster, right? And so the value of each individual ruble tanks exponentially. And the more it tanks, the more people panic sell. It's the countrywide version of a bank run. And that is the nightmare scenario for any country that experienced this, but especially Russia that has its own sovereign currency. Now, how do you stop people from pushing out, getting rid of your sovereign currency, the ruble, and how do you ensure that they instead, that you don't have this mass sell-off, this run on the bank, but the bank is the entire country? Well, the answer is you impose what are called capital controls. And capital controls refer to, they refer to this idea, exactly what Russia's talking about, freezing bank accounts, saying, listen, we're not going to let more rubles enter the system, so to speak, right? It's sort of a final last step. And it means that Russia is would be boxing itself into what's called the impossible trinity, or the trilemma. In international economics, this is a pretty fundamental concept, and it means that free flow of capital, meaning no capital controls. You can buy and sell currencies as you want, and you can only pick two of the three things in the triangle, right? So you can have your own monetary policy, and you can have capital come and go as you please, but it means that the value of the currency is not going to be able to be fixed. This is a problem for Russia because, as you could see, when the currency gets to be floated, valued at whatever the market says it is, that number is tanked. And so Russia says, well, we can't let it float to the natural bottom, right? It'll be too bad. We have to somehow stabilize this exchange rate. And they say, but we also want a free flow of capital, and we want to be able to adjust our interest rate as we see fit. Well, they can't do all three. And now that like we talked about, that the Kremlin appears to have intervened and said, we won't let you raise interest rates further, then they have no choice but to either abandon any efforts to stabilize the exchange rate and simply let the market set it, or restrict the flow of capital, right? In fact, they have no choice if they cannot see the ruble devalued more and they refuse to play with the interest rates. There is only one option left, and that is capital controls. So what do I think is really going to happen? I think the Russian central bank is going to go, oh, you silly Russians, we were never going to freeze your bank accounts. You can only just pull out 1,000 rubles a day. And that is a classic move, right? That is so incredibly par for the course, right? That's tried and true, to restrict people's ability to actually transact in quantities. Now, what you've done as the government is effectively stolen people's money. This is something that was also a problem in Lebanon for many years. And the capital controls locked up people's wealth inside the banks for decades. And it was when that sort of thing happens, it is sort of like It's like lighting your house on fire to stay warm, because temporarily it relieves the immediate problem. But what it does is create a larger, deeper problem that's harder to solve. And that larger, deeper problem, right, is that in a country that freezes bank accounts, people will never trust their banks again the rest of their lives. Because again, imagine you lock everyone's account up in Russia and you say, don't worry, we're still, your money's locked up, but they say, well, it's really expensive to pay all these interest rates and people can't pull their money out. So why are we paying them 20% interest? Let's pay them 5%. And every day, every month, in fact, in a country with hyperinflation, that 5% interest makes your money go up by little steps, but the inflation rate is exponential. So suddenly let's say your grandmother who saved her whole life got, let's say 100,000 rubles for her retirement, to fund her retirement. After 2 years of having her assets locked up, unable to be moved and put into more stable forms, that 100,000 rubles might buy a couple bags of groceries. And that sort of experience scars a public, scars the people that go through it, and that they have permanent distrust of the legitimate financial system. That means that banks don't have the sort of deposits they need to make loans. That means that businesses have to pay a lot more to get loans because there's so few depositors. It means that sort of black and gray market lenders become the lenders of default. It effectively moves your financial system from the legitimate side that can be regulated and, more importantly, can be tracked by, say, tax authorities, and moves it into the black market where the governments can't see what's going on, and more importantly, they can't identify their tax revenues or even determine if currencies are being used to if they're being used to buy groceries or buy drugs, if they're being used to fund a recycling business or fund a terror organization. And that sort of thing, that sort of environment is really hard to make economic policy. Even things like, is inflation bad? If you have only a shadow economy, a lot of times you have no idea because the state's ability to see inside of what's going on in its economy gets diminished. So if this proves true, and if I, as a betting man, I would say it probably will. Some version of it, right? It won't be a bank account freeze because that would starve the Russian public, literally. It's likely to be a bank account restriction where they can withdraw like a comically low amount of rubles every single day. But even that is going to be immensely problematic for the Russian public. Now, before we talk about the Australian national who was reportedly killed by Russian forces and Australia's response, I wanted to mention, first off, it's the new year, and you may need a secret weapon to get your New Year's resolutions done. I know I do. My resolution is to run a triathlon, and boy, is it a lot of pedaling around on a bike. So I need, of course, caffeine that works for me. That's why I created Strike Gum, inspired by my time in Afghanistan. In fact, I gave this out to units in Ukraine that were pounding energy drinks. And I was like, guys, when you can fit this in one of your, go pockets, on your vest, and you can get 100 milligrams of caffeine, 90 milligrams of caffeine. That's as much as an energy drink, as much as a Red Bull, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, 0 sugar. And you can get the equivalent of 5 energy drinks in this pack, right? When I'm on the bike, pop it, chew it, go, and I can keep pounding out the miles. It's helped me achieve my New Year's resolution. I want to help you achieve yours. So go to strikegum.com, or you can go to Amazon. The link is right there in the description, right? You can't miss us. We're the highest rated energy gum on Amazon. So if you're looking for that secret weapon, look no further than Strike Gum. Okay, so let's talk about the Australian national. Now, you guys who have been following the news might have noticed that there was a viral video recently of Russian forces capturing an Australian volunteer. This was a 32-year-old man named Oscar Jenkins who had been fighting with the Ukrainians for some time and was captured by Russian forces alive. In fact, the video was filmed by Russian forces who clearly showed him identifying himself, giving biographical information only he would know. And so it was very clear that he'd been captured alive. And so when there are rumors that he was killed, in fact, they claim that his body had been found but not yet officially identified, It is a huge issue for the Russian foreign minister. In fact, Australian foreign minister Penny Wong said that the Australian government is working, quote, very hard to confirm the report that Australian Oscar Jenkins had been killed. They have grave concerns for his welfare. Right. And Wong told broadcaster and ABC that Russia's ambassador to Australia had been called in this week at her request over the matter. And when asked about how Australia might react to the killing if it's confirmed, she said, quote, "I want to be clear, all options are on the table." Right? Now, the Kremlin, of course, sort of burying a classic Kremlin misdirection, said it was not aware if the Australians had raised a specific case with Russia's foreign ministry, but said foreigners fighting with Ukraine were legal targets for Russian troops. Right? And they said they are fighting against our military with weapons in their hands. Accordingly, they become legal targets. But Australia's foreign minister, calling them out on their BS, said that Russia still has an obligation to treat prisoners of war in line with international law, including humane treatment and the right to a fair trial, right? And this is, I think, a really important distinction. I want to point out that Australia, or at least Australian Prime Minister, said it will take, quote, the strongest possible action if Russia has indeed harmed one of its nationals captured fighting for Ukraine. And this is now, here's the thing. Here's the problem with this. The problem is not that was Mr. Jenkins fighting for Ukraine. He almost certainly was. And was he captured alive by Russians? Also almost certainly true. The problem is that one, Russia says any foreigner fighting for Ukraine is considered a mercenary. But this is not the definition of a mercenary, right? And so the definition of a mercenary in the international law of war, a mercenary, right, does not have the right to be a combatant or prisoner of war. A mercenary is any person who is recruited, who has to meet several conditions. He has to be recruited locally or abroad in order to fight in an armed conflict, does take part in hostilities, motivated essentially by the desire for private gain, and is promised by or to on behalf of the party of the conflict material compensation substantially in excess of that promised or paid to combatants of similar ranks and functions in the armed forces, and is not a national of a party of the conflict nor a resident of the territory, and is not a member of the armed forces of the party in conflict, right? So there are two key things there that make it obviously true that Mr. Jenkins is not. One, everyone in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion or other Ukrainian armed force units are a member of the armed forces. They are integrated fully into the armed forces of that country, right? Of Ukraine. They answer to Ukrainian high command. They wear Ukrainian uniforms, Ukrainian flags, Ukrainian radios. They are legally a member of the Ukrainian armed forces. They also do not derive material compensation in excess of that promised or paid to combatants of similar ranks and functions in the armed forces. In fact, again, because they are members of the armed forces, they simply draw a standard combatant pay. They are not paid in excess of the Ukrainian armed forces themselves. So, therefore, they probably do not meet the definition of mercenary. And if they did, the way to determine this would be a fair trial, right? You would have to try someone as a mercenary, determine them to be a mercenary, and then decide if you're going to treat them as a combatant or prisoner of war. And because Mr. Jenkins very clearly was serving in the armed forces of Ukraine, that he therefore was entitled to treatment as a prisoner of war, and his killing, if proven to be at the hands of Russian forces, would constitute a war crime. This is very obvious. Now, the question is, Australians, right, like a lot of Western governments in this conflict, their rhetoric is up here. All options on the table, strongest possible response. But does anyone really think that? Remember, 38 Australians were killed on the Malaysian Airlines flight that was shot down by Russian-backed separatists, and the Australians did virtually nothing in response to that. Now, are they willing to actually try to exact justice? Will Russia face any consequences for committing war crimes against Australian nationals? The answer is almost certainly going to be no. This is just performative, and the Australian government, like all Western governments, again, their rhetoric is here, their action is here. And I think that's what you're going to see continued. I'd like to be proven wrong, but again, after 3 years of covering this conflict, I know that I won't be. Nothing ever quite really lets you down as much as Western governments. And I would just prefer them to be honest. I'd prefer the Australian government to be transparent with its people and say, listen, Mr. Jenkins chose to fight for the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian forces commit war crimes all the time. This is public knowledge. It's while you feel bad for his family, there's nothing we can do about it at the end, right? But of course, that itself is a sign to not just the Australians, but the rest of the international community that Russia can do anything it wants, and Australia just kind of has to take it, which is sort of a depressing state for one of the world's most developed democracies to be in. Now, there's one last story that I think is really important to highlight. This is the rumor that Ukraine is transferring Air Force personnel to infantry amid troop shortages. And this isn't one of those rumors that you don't really like to see, but is reportedly that the Ukrainian Air Force will transfer military personnel en masse to the reinforced ground force combat brigades in early 2025. This is according to Ukrainian Pravda, citing an undisclosed Air Force source. This is, of course, their infantry. This is, of course, in the midst of an infantry shortage across the front lines, and Ukraine has been forced to make difficult adjustments as Russia continues to push its offensive in Donetsk, right? Now, according to Pravda, there was a secret order issued January 11th to transfer 5,000 Air Force personnel to ground force units, and the transfers began in spring 2024 and have now reached a critical level with Air Force unit staffing dropping to 50%. Right. And if the Air Force says if we carry out this order, unit staffing will drop to a mere 40%. And that even transferring what they call unimportant personnel weakens unit effectiveness, citing anti-aircraft missile systems, which rely on well-trained, cohesive teams. So this, I think, is a really telling thing is that, remember, the Ukrainian Air Force, not just responsible for flying aircraft, which have a sort of support role in the battlefield, but that these anti-aircraft missile systems are, again, this is a little bit of another version of burning down your house to stave off the cold. Ukraine, without its anti-aircraft missile systems, crews are going to have a really hard time. And if those experienced crews are able to engage targets with a high level of efficacy, it's going to be a net loss if you have less effective crews or crews that need additional training to get up to standard. You're going to see more of these Russian drones get through, and you're going to see more of these more missiles expended for fewer kills, right? Now, this is controversial because the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces denied transferring Air Force engineer and aviation personnel to infantry units, which is interesting because they also say that technical and flight personnel numbers are increasing, but this is not the same thing as an outright denial. They said some Air Force and other branch personnel, after completing training, are being reassigned to strengthen ground brigades amid a critical infantry shortage. The General Staff noted this is a necessary measure to bolster frontline defenses, but confirmed specialists in high-tech roles of those trained abroad in foreign equipment are exempt from transfers. Now, this is, again, sort of something we've also seen from the Russian military. And that where Russia has taken units from its naval forces and then transferred them allegedly into naval infantry brigades, which then fight in Ukraine. This is certainly, and this is something that's common among militaries with critical personnel shortages. What's sort of bothersome is that, one of the things that the West and the United States has told Ukraine is you have to lower your conscription age. Right now, they don't start drafting people until they turn about 25. And the fact is that instead of reaching into the population of young men, every month, some of them turn 25, the Ukrainians instead are starting to eat their own armed forces. But you can't cannibalize your armed forces in this sense. And while they need infantry troops, the best way to get them, again, is likely going to be some kind of lowering of the draft age, right? And it's just unfortunate. Again, this is a story that I believe. There's been, literally over 100 service members describing similar cases. So I think this is another true story, and a sign again that in the absence of legislative change by the Ukrainian government to create new legislation that lowers the mobilization age, you're going to see more and more of this cannibalization. So again, this is the classic war of attrition race to the bottom, where, Russia ultimately is facing fewer personnel shortages, but while the Ukrainian public continues to support the war, the Russian public will likely only tolerate Putin's war as long as it doesn't affect them and their bottom line. And so, again, it's a little bit like a Vietnam War situation where the cost to the United States was lower relative to what the price Vietnam was paying, but the North Vietnamese were so much more committed to the fight that at the end of the day, the winner wasn't necessarily the side that took fewer casualties. It was, or was more short on personnel and equipment. It was the side that was more committed to the fight. And so I think that that path to victory, so to speak, definitely remains, especially if they end up in a situation where the Kremlin does feel it has to freeze bank accounts. Anyway, guys, thank you so much to all the Colonel tier members like James Gerling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Jill McCombs, James Ola, Henry Roussier, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.